Hello everyone, Reza here. In this video, I will show you how to create conditional and dynamic approvals. The scenario for conditional approvals will be travel request. If the amount that the user plugs in for the travel request is greater than 500, we will add an additional layer of approval from the user's manager. And once the manager approves, we will route the approval to the HR team. In the second scenario, we will allow the users to start the approval process on demand, pick the approvers they want dynamically, and the approval type or the approval pattern. So let's check it out in action. The first scenario is around value-based conditional approval. The use case is a travel request scenario. Users create these travel requests in a SharePoint list based upon the amount that the user enters for the travel request. If that value is greater than or equal to a certain amount, we will enforce manager approval for that travel request, and then it will go to the second level of approval, which is the HR approval. If the dollar amount for the travel request is less than the specified amount, it will directly go to the HR approval. The travel request list, I can fill the details of the travel request, start date, end date, pick the airlines I want to travel with, and then enter the estimated airfare. I'll click save, and that information will be logged in my travel request list. I've created two columns to track the approval scenario. One of them is the approval status, which has the following statuses: default status new, and then the approval comments, which is a multi-line text field to track the comments logged during the process. To create the approval workflow, in Power Automate, I will select an automated cloud flow that triggers when an item is created in a SharePoint list. I'll click create. In the trigger, I'll pick my SharePoint site and my SharePoint list. For the created item, I need to first check if the estimated airfare, let's say, is greater than or equal to 500. If that's the case, I need to include the user's manager's approval first for the travel request. I will add a simple condition, pick the condition control. The value will come from dynamic content, estimated airfare. If this is greater than or equal to 500. I need to get an approval from the user's manager. And to get the manager information for the user who created the item, I will add an action. The action is called Get Manager from the Office 365 Users Connector. The user principal name, I will pick the dynamic content property created by email from the trigger action. Right before starting the approval process, I would like to set the status of the travel request to pending manager approval. For that, I will update the item in the same travel request list. The ID will come from the trigger action. Any mandatory fields that you have in your SharePoint list, you would have to refill them. In my case, estimated airfare is that mandatory column, so I'll refill that from the trigger. My update item goal was to update the status to pending manager approval. And in the approval commands, manager approval pending, and I can even put the display name of the manager from dynamic content. After this, I want to start the approval process. So I will use the start and wait for an approval action. My approval type, I'll pick first to respond. The title would be the title of the travel request that the user puts in. Approval request by. I can put the display name of the user who created the travel request in the title. Assign to the user's manager. So I will pick the mail dynamic content property from the get manager action. I can put the title, the reason for travel, and other pieces of information. I'll pick the link to item, and the description of the link could be the title of the item. The flow will wait for a response. The response would either be approve or reject. So to check the outcome of this approval, I will add an action. Once again, a condition. There's a dynamic content property called outcome. If this is equal to approve, then we need to start the HR approval process. But before doing that, I want to once again update the item so I can change the status of the item to pending HR approval. I will copy the update item action that I had before and paste that in here. I will change the approval status to pending HR approval. And in the approval commands, I can mention approved by the manager. And I can also put the comments that the approver plugged in. If the manager does not approve it, in that case, I need to update the status of the item. The status would be updated to rejected. And in the approval commands, I can say rejected by the manager and plug in the comments that the manager put in. Now this completes the manager approval scenario. And the next step is to begin the HR approval. And best practice, always rename your actions. There are two scenarios in which it could go to the HR approval. One, the estimated airfare cost is less than 500, so I need to start the HR approval. Basically, I need to add that action here. However, if it goes to the manager approval and if the manager approves, I need to then conduct the HR approval. So I have to add that same logic here as well. Now that's duplicate logic in the flow. You don't want to repeat the same set of steps in two places. And in order to write that HR approval logic only once, right before the manager condition, I will add an action in which I will initialize a variable. I have renamed the action to HR approval and the variable name, I've called it var HR approval, type boolean. By default, I'll keep it to true. Now the only scenario in which the HR approval is not required is when the manager rejects the travel request, where we are checking the outcome of the manager approval if it is not equal to approved, where we are updating the status of the item to rejected. Right after that, I will add an action to set that variable, which is the HR approval variable, to the expression false. Now this variable will be true if the HR approval is needed. If it's not needed, it would be false. So right after the manager condition, I will add a new step and add my condition, my HR approval condition, if that variable value is equal to the expression true. If this is true, we start the HR approval. I'll pick first to respond. My title will be HR approval request for the title of the travel request. I'll assign this to my HR team. Now you can plug in group email addresses here. In my case, I'll keep it simple. I'll assign this to the HR manager, James. I can put in the details like before. I need to check the outcome of this action, so I'll add a condition. If the outcome of my HR approval action is approved, then I'll want to update the item. The status of the item would be set to approved. The comments will be approved by HR. If I need the display name of the approver, I can pick the response's approver name, and then I can also plug in the comments that the approver provided in their response. If the HR approver did not approve it, then I will update the item to rejected, put the approver name, and put the approval comments. Also, in case the manager approval is not required, I need to update the item to set the status of the item to pending HR approval. That completes my flow. I'll click save. The flow is ready to go. The flow is listening to any new travel request that comes in. I'll create a new travel request. The dollar amount for this scenario, I'll plug in more than $500. And let's create another one wherein the dollar amount for the estimated airfare is less than $500. The first travel request that I created, the flow has triggered because a new travel request was created. And because the dollar amount was greater than $500, it has gone for the manager approval. Reza is creating the request. Sarah is my manager in Active Directory. So it's gone ahead and created an approval request and assigned that task to Sarah. The workflow has triggered for the second travel request as well. This time though, the approval has gone directly to the HR user and we can see the status is pending HR approval. So it's completely bypassed the manager approval. That's because dollar amount, it's less than 500. So it's gone straight away to the HR manager's approval. First scenario, which is travel to New York. It's gone to Sarah, who's my manager. Here's the travel request email that Sarah has received. Sarah can see the details. There's a link here that takes Sarah directly to the travel request information that Reza plugged in into the SharePoint list. Sarah can see all the details and take her decision of whether she wants to approve it or reject it. In this case, Sarah says approve. Sarah plugs in her commands and submits her approval response directly inside the email itself. That information gets logged. We can see the status changing live in the SharePoint list. The status has now moved to pending HR approval since Sarah, who was the manager, had approved the request. And here is the commands that Sarah plugged in. Now it's gone for HR approval. It's gone to the user James. And James will have two requests. One, travel to New York, and the other one, which is travel to Atlanta. Signed in as James. The travel request for Atlanta that James has received. Let's go ahead and reject this one. Plug in the commands and submit the response. And here's the second approval request that James received, which is the travel to New York. Let's go ahead and approve this one. As these responses are coming in, if we look at our SharePoint list, we can see the status is changing on the fly. The travel to New York was approved by James, and here are the commands. The travel to Atlanta was rejected by James, and here are the commands. The next scenario is where the user themselves can decide who the approvers are going to be during the process. Plus, they can also pick the pattern of approval that they would like to apply. I have a content scheduler list in which I can track content that I scheduled to publish. And let's say the users who are creating these items need to on demand call an approval process and select who the approvers are. In modern SharePoint list itself, if you head over to integrate and power automate and select create a flow, we are provided with a wide variety of templates to choose from. One of them that I highly recommend you to look at is called request approval first to respond for a selected item. So let's go ahead and select this one. These are the connectors that the flow leverages. I'll click create flow. I will go ahead and edit this flow. First, I'll give this flow a name. In this flow, there are some really neat patterns that we can learn from. The trigger of the flow is for a selected item. So when the user selects an item in the content scheduler list, they are presented with a form wherein they can plug in information. What's the message that you want to send to the approvers? Who these approvers are, and they can plug in the email addresses right here. Whether you want to send reminders or not to those approvers if they haven't responded to that approval action for a specific duration, and how frequently do you want those reminders. Here, it goes ahead and creates the approval. Here's the parallel branch that sends those approval reminders if the approvers have not responded. It's dynamically assigning the task to the approvers that you've picked in the trigger action. Then the flow waits for the response from the approver. Once the response is received, It creates a nice HTML table of all the responses that have been captured along with the commands. And if the final outcome is approved, it sends the user who triggered the flow an email that the item has been approved along with the approval information, and it notifies the user in case of rejection as well. So I'll go ahead and save this flow, which I built straight out from a template. And this is dynamic in nature since I will be picking my approvers on the fly. Back to my SharePoint list, let me add a new item in the content scheduler list. And I can save my list item. Now, if I need the approval workflow, I can trigger it on demand by selecting this, heading over to Automate, and the flow that I created from that template and the name that I gave it is right here, which is Content Approval Workflow. So I can select this. It will now launch the side panel. I have to sign in once to all the connectors. Once I sign in, I get this panel on the right-hand side, which has all those questions that were the input parameters in the trigger of the flow. So what's the message I want to send to the approvers? And here, who are my approvers? I can dynamically pick my approvers right here. I'll pick Sarah. You can even pick male-enabled groups right here. I'll pick Sarah and James as the approvers. If I want, I can send approval reminders on specific durations. I'll keep that no for now, and I will run this flow. My workflow has now been triggered. It will send the approval task to Sarah and James. Here is the approval email that Sarah has received with all the information of my list item, including a link to the item. The approval type based on this template is first to respond. So whoever responds first, their decision will be considered final. So let's say Sarah responds with approved, plugs in her commands, and clicks submit. The workflow now will go ahead and complete and send the person who triggered the flow, which was Reza, an email notification that my content scheduler item, which was Power Automate Video, has been approved. And here is the response that the approver has provided. The approver was Sarah. Here are the comments that Sarah plugged in, and here's the response. Now that is some really neat information available right here in the email itself. You can customize this template based on your needs. I have a column in my list called approval status, which has three options: approved, pending, and rejected. Plus, I can add a column called approval comments of type multi-lines of text. Now in the workflow, right before creating the approval, I will initiate an action where I will update the item in my content scheduler list. I'll pick the ID of the item from the trigger action. Any mandatory fields I would have to refill. My goal here is to change the approval status to pending since I am starting the approval. If the outcome of the approval is approved, I will once again update the item. I will change the status to approved, and approval commands, I will pick the output of HTML table with styles, which has all the approval information. And in the no side of the branch, I'll do the same thing, but the status would be rejected. Now that I've made these small changes, I will save my flow. Let's create a brand new item. My item is created. I'm ready to begin the workflow. I plug in my message, pick my approvers, and I will start the approval process. This time, when the workflow begins, the first thing I did was I changed the approval status to pending, and we can see that live in action. Now Sarah and James would have received the approval request. I've signed in as James, and let's say James rejects the idea, plugs in his commands, and submits his response. Since James rejected it, the approval status has changed to rejected. And if we look at the approval commands, here is all that information. The approver was James. Here's the commands that James plugged in. And here's the response that we received. Now in the approval action, the key aspect here is the approval type. And we have 4 options to choose from. The basic ones are approve or reject, first to respond. That is, if there are multiple approvers, the first person to respond, their decision will be considered final. The other one is everyone must approve. So every approver has to say approved. If even one approver says reject, the process is rejected. And then you also have the ability of creating your own custom responses and either wait for all responses or wait for one response. We want to make the approval type dynamic as well. One thing I want you to note here is for the approval action, with first to respond selected as the approval type, if I go to the 3 ellipses and head over to peak code, here, if you focus on a property called path, that's the type of the approval. The type here is basic. So basic is that keyword that this action expects in order to perform first to respond approval type. If I change this to everyone must approve, now if I go to peak code, you will observe a change here. It says basic await all. And those are the paths that the approval type expects. If I try and make this dynamic, basically I try and enter a custom value. Now to get that custom value from the user who's triggering this flow, in the for a selected item trigger itself, I will add an input of type text. I will call this approval type. If I head over to 3 ellipses, I can make this a drop-down list of options. My first option would be everyone should approve. I can add my own text here. And the second option will be first to respond. Now for this action as well, if you go to 3 ellipses and peak code, there's a property here called required. The column that I just created, it actually got assigned an internal value called text_1. So I need to grab this value and accordingly set the approval type. Approval type, I will change this to enter custom value, and I will head over to expression. My condition would be if equals, the first property of equals will be trigger body. From here, I want to get text_1 since that's the internal name of that input action that I added. If this is equal to the text everyone should approve, that's the exact text that I entered in that input property. If that's the case, I want you to pick the type as basic await all, since that's the code that it plugged in when I looked at peak code for everyone must approve type. Otherwise, you pick the basic type of approval, which is first to respond. I'll click OK. Because the approval type is dynamic, it cannot expose those properties, so it converts it into this object, and it already has all of those key properties plugged in that we need. And since we've made this change, finally where we are checking the outcome of the approval, we need to make one tweak here. If the outcome does not contain reject, the reason why we changed this is because if the approval type is everyone must approve, I will get multiple outcomes. I'll save the flow. I'll create a new item. I'll start the approval. I'll assign this to James and Sarah. And here I have a new input type, which is the approval type. So now I need to decide, do I want all my approvers here to say approved and then this status should get approved? Or do I want to consider the first approver who responds their decision to be final? I'll pick everyone should approve this time and run the flow. Once the flow triggers, the status is pending, and now both Sarah and James will receive the approval action. Here's the approval email for Sarah. Sarah will go ahead and approve this, plugs in her commands, and submits her response. If we look at the item in SharePoint, the status is still pending. That's because the approval action would still be running this time. The reason is because the approval type is basic await all. It will wait for all the approvers to say approved. Here is the approval action for James. James also goes ahead and approves and provides his decision. Now that all the decision is recorded, The approval status changes to approve. Here are the approvers, the comments they plugged in, and their individual responses are also logged. Here's another item. This one, my approvers are Reza and James. My approval type is first to respond. So whoever responds first, their decision would be considered final. So here's the approval task for James. James approves this. If Reza goes to that approval email task, it says that there is no approval needed because that task is already closed since it was first to respond and James has already responded. And here we can see how the status has changed to approved, and the only responder here was James because the approval type was first to respond. If you enjoyed this video, then do like, comment and subscribe to my YouTube channel, and thank you so much for watching.